So this is planning a sexual violence support group, and it's part of the Rural Sexual Violence Support Group webinar series. This training will focus on supporting facilitation and planning of rural sexual violence support groups. While some of this information can be applied to support groups in rural areas, this training is only about sexual violence support groups. We will not be discussing domestic violence or any other type of support groups in this webinar, but we may reference them. Here are our objectives for the day. First, we will identify the basic components of a sexual violence support group. Then we will analyze the challenges of those support groups in rural areas. After that, we're going to review the different types of sexual violence support groups. Then we're going to discuss the logistics and implementation, best practices for support groups. And then we'll end the day with identifying some key elements and tangibles for support groups. So the first thing I'm going to ask you all to do is participate in this Mentimator. So what you all need to do is go to www.menti.com, and the web address is on your screen, and then type in the code 513494. Again, it is 513494. And I believe, as always, thank you, Victoria. She has dropped that in the chat. And I'm going to pull it up on my screen now, so hopefully you all can see it. Okay. So some of you have already began to answer this question, and unfortunately I had it on the wrong question. So we're gonna go back a bit. Okay, this is the first question. Particularly in rural areas, what is the most difficult part of holding a sexual violence support group? Particularly in rural areas, what is the most difficult part of holding a sexual violence support group? Getting all the key players to get involved. Transportation, babysitters, absolutely. In rural Kentucky, oh, hello from Kentucky. Transportation availability to make up the largest issues. Most of the people who have made the decision to attend are not worried about community perceptions if they feel safe. Transport, participants showing up on time, absolutely. And we know with trauma survivors, time might be difficult for them. Being in a small community, confidentiality is a concern, as well as individuals feeling safe and comfortable to speak about it. Absolutely, and we'll really talk about that a little later, about how we really need to honor survivors who do participate in support groups. Any other thoughts? Particularly in rural areas, what is the most difficult part of holding a sexual violence support group? Seeing some folks are using the chat box, so I'm going to read some of those answers too. Small town gossip, distance, absolutely. Representation, access. Thank you all for getting all of these things. Small town ideas, everyone knows one another. Absolutely, thank you all for participating. And we're gonna touch on at least everything I think that was mentioned. But yeah, this is what we hear, you know, there's this these specific mindsets, transportation, if people wanna participate, transportation and childcare are barriers. So these are just things that we need to think about. Some of you already began to answer this next question, but have you ever facilitated a sexual violence support group before? Oh, I don't know why the voting is closed. Should be back open now. Thanks, everybody. Have you ever facilitated in a sexual violence support group before? All right, so for those who participated, it looks like the majority of us haven't, but there are a couple of us that have. So if you have facilitated a sexual violence support group before, please feel free to add your wealth of knowledge in the chat box so we can all find some resources too. Thanks, everyone. So let's keep in mind some of those things that we talked about and what might be barriers for participants who want to attend. And when we're strategizing and thinking about our planning process, how we can meet some of those barriers. But first things first, what is a sexual violence support group? A support group, unsurprisingly enough, is a group that focuses on social relationships, skill development, and healing of people who have experienced sexual violence. The difference between a sexual violence support group and other groups is its emphasis on building social skills and relationships. In other states, they might refer to those types of groups as a psychosocial educational group, but they really serve the same purpose. Especially for survivors of sexual violence, and especially for survivors in rural areas, support groups can be important. Support groups and survivors usually cite feeling alone and isolated, and these feelings are often amplified in smaller communities. Groups are a great place for survivors to be able to build healthy connections with those who have had similar experiences. Also, sexual violence support groups are a part of those core services of sexual violence programs. So this is why we're happy to finally be able to get into the nitty-gritty of them with you all today. So another question, because I am not really fond of the sound of my own voice and I really want to know what you all think. What are the differences between support groups and therapeutic groups? And please answer in the chat box. What are the differences between support groups and therapeutic groups? Who's putting it on? Clinical involvement, okay. What do others think? What are the differences between a support group and a therapeutic group? Therapeutic groups are typically led by therapist clinicians. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you all. So you all named one of the easiest things to just parse out. Yes, therapeutic groups are supported by therapists. So thank you. Support groups can be led by clergy, coaches, others who have experienced groups. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for voicing that. Okay, you all pretty much got it. Support groups and therapeutic groups have different outcomes and expectations. So you all already named that support groups can really be ran by anyone, including advocates and therapists. And so that's majority of the people who attend our trainings. But I also really want us to acknowledge that the first support groups were started and ran for and by survivors. Best practice now is for those facilitating support groups to have experience working with sexual violence survivors, handling disclosures, and some basic facilitation skills. Support groups also really focus on building those social relationships and coping skills. Therapeutic groups have specific plans and intervention goals that are reliant on prescribed deliveries and outcomes. Yes, and thank you for someone who put it in the Q&A box. You can also speak a little bit more freely in a support group. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Therapists are also specially trained to provide specific interventions and can give advice to survivors, while it is the role of the advocate to give information, education, and resources, but not advice. Circle of Hope had this to say in regard to therapists who do facilitate support groups. Although therapists may have the training and expertise to run a therapy group, when conducting a psychoeducational support group, the therapist must remove their therapeutic hat and not engage in therapeutic activities within the confines of the psychoeducational support group. Therapists serving as psychoeducational support group facilitators are functioning as advocates and should have a clear understanding of the foundations and techniques of advocacy work. This is also a shameless plug for everyone on this webinar to check out the Circle of Hope and the Power of Social Connections Sexual Assault Support Group Guides. So both of these guides are very comprehensive, and I will be referencing them a lot during this presentation. They have information about everything in regards to support groups, including how to facilitate support groups, ideas for support groups, and they even have appendices with forms you can copy for your groups, so check them out. And if Victoria would, could you please drop those, and she's already done it, drop those free resources for you all in the chat. So if you've been to any of the sexual violence webinars recently, you can probably recite this exact slide from memory. Everything we do as sexual violence advocates, including our support group facilitation, which we'll be talking about today, our discussion and content, and the activities should be done under the lens of trauma-informed care. We as advocates and facilitators need to make sure that we're demonstrating trust and that we're communicating with survivors about their choices. We need to make sure that we're acknowledging and voicing those strengths that survivors have, and it should be clear that we honor and uplift cultural differences in our work. Trauma-informed care should be reflected throughout the sexual violence support group because it is an extension of our role as advocates. Support groups also have some tangible goals and outcomes, and these shouldn't be confused with the goals of each support group session. There should be a mutual exchange of support and information amongst the group participants. And as these relationships naturally grow and develop, this should become more natural and innate. There's also that mutual support and group cohesion. And through connecting with others and learning more about each other and their experiences, the group should also begin to form their own identities amongst each other and a sense of belonging due to their similar experiences. There's also skill application, and there should be a change in the group's individual and combined coping skills. Support groups are the perfect place for survivors to not only learn about new skills, but they also are a safe place for them to practice those skills in a controlled environment. And if survivors are able to build relationships, strengthen their coping skills, and learn and discuss in a safe way, then they should be able to see a reduction of stress and in some of the traumatic symptoms in their lives. Yes, we're going to take a quick pause just to make sure that everyone can still hear me. If you can, just put a yes in the chat box. Okay, looks like folks can still hear me, so I'm going to continue on. Thank you so much. Because every support group is different, these stages that we see on the slide are pretty fluid. Additionally, depending on what type of support group it is, the information for each stage can shift, but in general, there are 3 major stages a support group will have. Stage 1 is the forming stage. And this is when the group initially comes together and the group members are getting to know each other. During this stage, participants learn about the group, the guidelines and agreements, and other members. This is also when the group works towards some agreement on goals, and there is an emphasis on establishing trust and relationships within the group. And this stage can last around 3 sessions, and it is imperative that in this stage, facilitators work to build trust between the facilitators and the participants, but also amongst the participants. Especially in rural communities, the participants may be familiar with each other in some way, and it's important that these expectations around confidentiality and safety are set. Stage 2 is the norming and performing phase. This is when participants start becoming more comfortable around each other and start to form a group identity. This is also the stage where some conflicts might arise in the group as each person starts to learn each other and their communication styles. It's important during this stage that the facilitator encourages the participation of all group members and is careful not to allow individual participants to control the flow of the group. The group should still be focusing on building relationships and practicing safety, but it's also when the focus can expand to include learning new skills and absorbing content. If the group is a short-term group, so it's like maybe between 9 and 12 weeks, the majority of this session will be spent in this stage. And then stage 3, that is a little bit more succinct, is when the group is transitioning to a close. This stage will generally begin a couple of weeks before the group officially ends, and it might be difficult for survivors who have come to rely on the group as a place of constant support, comfort, and safety to have the group end. It's normal for them to experience some grief or feeling of loss, particularly in a well-formed group. And it's important that facilitators make space to acknowledge these feelings and include activities that focus on transition at the end of the group. So you might be wondering, Lachey, where does this webinar fit into this chart? And in reality, it doesn't. Because we love our plant metaphors at the Coalition, these stages are like the flower, and this webinar is really the root. We want to do all this planning and prep work so that our support groups are grounded and well-planned and able to thrive. Then we have some support group roles. So we have the participants, /attendees/survivors, and then we have the facilitators. Usually we use the word survivors when we're talking about people who have experienced sexual violence, but during this series, I will predominantly use the term participants. And now we are going to watch a video. And you all, please let me know if you can hear it in the chat.
Part of the best part for me of the Men's Project was not just talking, but listening. My 4th group at the Men's Project, I heard my first testimony, a friend of mine to this day. And it struck me profoundly. He said out loud that he had been raped. And he had strength in his eyes. And I thought, holy God. There was 8 of us in the room. He was looking proudly and talking about being raped. And I thought, holy shit. And I realized I want what he has. I want that. It was an incredibly moving feeling of totally discovering for myself that recovery is actually possible. Well, I wasn't happening totally yet, but I began to really believe that if I worked at this, my life would not be ruled, dominated by my childhood. That the demons and the darkness didn't define me anymore.
Yeah, so we really like that video because it shows just the power of support groups, right? The speaker mentioned that that person who he admired had become friends, right? And he was able to see what growth was possible for him, see someone else who was further along in the healing journey. So support groups really do matter, even if they might not have all of these tangible things, even if it's only able to help survivors heal a little bit, they're worth doing. So these are the different support group types. And there are many different types of support groups, and they are all unique, just like those who participate in them. So while I have outlined some of the major categories of groups we have seen, there are many combinations of hybrids of these types of groups that exist. So we're going to review all of them in detail, but remember, the best type of support group for your community has to be reflective of the various needs in your community. First, we have closed support groups, and these are the more traditional and formalized type of groups. These groups have screening requirements, and they have a select number of participants, typically 6 to 8, and will run for a predetermined period of time. This group may be well suited for participants who appreciate structure and predictability, which are also parts of trauma-informed care. Also, because of the nature of this group, there might be a planned curriculum or workbook that participants can follow and know what topics will be discussed. This group also allows for survivors to know who will be in attendance as well. On the opposite side, because of this rigid structure, this may not be the group for survivors who would like more flexibility. Additionally, if we're screening people into services, that ultimately means that we're screening people out of them. And if someone wants to join this type of group after the group starts, they will have to wait till the group session starts over again. Also, closed groups also run for a select number of weeks, so this may not work for survivors who want continuous support from a support group. Open support groups provide more flexible options in terms of screening and support. Open groups allow for more freedom when it comes to discussion and topics, and this may be a place for the group and facilitators who collaborate. Another byproduct of having a more open attendance policy is that it may be easier to manage conflicts for those whose personality and communication styles clash and aren't seeing each other every group. This also offers more flexible attendance options for people who can't make it to every week or every other week or whatever attendance policies have been set in a closed group. But there are also some aspects of an open group that can cause issues as well. Inconsistent attendance can make it harder to build relationships and follow a set curriculum. If there's no screening options, then survivors wouldn't know who could come and show up to the group, which automatically makes the group less confidential and less secure. Not only is this group less predictable for the attendees, but for the facilitators as well. If facilitators aren't able to screen survivors, they won't be able to meet new participants or prepare them about what to expect in and from the support group. Next, we have in-person support groups. So these are also part of the more traditional method and delivery of support groups. In-person groups allow for a single place for survivors to be together, do activities, and communicate face-to-face. Having a secure physical location might also be another layer of safety for survivors who need that. For those cons, an obvious reason for us right now is COVID. Many in-person groups have stopped now, but there are still some that have moved to virtual platforms. As some of you named when we were talking about some of the barriers, transportation can be a major barrier for folks. So we know some places in rural Arizona live 2 to 3 hours away from services, so driving 2 hours a week every week might not be feasible for survivors. Even if they live close to services, a lack or dependence on public transportation can also be a barrier. Some of you also named childcare, and we know that can be a barrier for people coming to a physical space, so we need to be conscious as facilitators of this as well. Also, because a lot of sexual violence survivors do not utilize shelter services, that source of childcare may not be available to the participants in our groups. We also have to consider how accessible and visible the location is as well. If the location has entrances that face the street or people can easily see as they're walking on by, that could be a confidentiality issue for the survivor who might have ties to that community. Also, if the space doesn't have handicap parking, it doesn't have reader-friendly print, or doesn't have a bilingual option, this location might be inaccessible as well. And so now we have virtual platforms. Particularly for rural communities, virtual services can be a lifeline, as participants can connect almost wherever they are with a phone or with a computer. So for example, a survivor in Page can attend a support group in Snowflake, but also might be able to still watch their niece and nephew. Survivors can also attend virtually and not have to show their face or use a real name if they wish. And because there are some free virtual platforms, survivors can save time and money on transportation. Participants on virtual platforms can also engage and leave the group quickly if they need to. But there are still some virtual concerns when it comes to those virtual groups. Beyond these things on the slide, thanks, Victoria. So beyond these things on the slide, it might be difficult for participants to navigate the new platform for the group. So it's important that advocates provide both instructions and tutorials for how to access the group. And Victoria just right now put in the digital communications guide from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And so you all can check that out as a resource as well. We also aren't sure in virtual settings if we can completely secure the physical space that a survivor is in, so we can never be sure who's listening outside of the view of the camera. We also have to be conscious of technology harassment and abuse as well, along with monitoring the accessibility of the actual platform. Participants also may just not be able to find a safe or quiet place near them to be able to talk. And then we know that lastly, sometimes technology isn't great. So where Victoria is at right now, sometimes her Wi-Fi goes out, and so it's really hard to have meetings. She can't always see my face when we're having discussions. So we know technology just isn't always reliable as well. Now we have population/culturally inclusive groups. And these groups are groups that anyone, regardless of their cultural background or identity, can attend. These groups open up and are more reflective of the entire community, and it may give survivors a chance to have interactions with people from different backgrounds and populations. But we still have to be diligent of letting our support group get that quote unquote, we serve everyone stamp of approval. Many services, including sexual violence support groups, still end up being white, heterosexual, middle to lower class, cis women centered. If this continues to be the case, participants from non-dominant cultures may not see themselves or their identities reflected in the content, discussion, activities, which means the group isn't really inclusive in practice. Facilitators must have a strong understanding of oppression and may have to do work to address stereotypes and biases within the group. So if we have culturally and population inclusive groups, then we also have culturally specific support groups. And these are groups in which all the members of the group share the same culture or identity. Just to make sure we all have the same understanding, just because someone is a part of a specific culture, that doesn't mean that they want to be in the culturally specific group. Especially in more smaller and tight-knit communities, they may not want to at all because someone they know is already in the group. This is one example of why it's so important to have a selection of different support groups for survivors to choose from. On a similar note, if we're going to offer culturally specific options, there needs to be a facilitator who is well-trained and comfortable facilitating for that population. It's best that for culturally specific groups, in most instances, that the facilitator is either from the community or very well known in the community prior to the group starting. Also, where there are culturally and / population specific options, there needs to be inclusive ones as well. Participants in culturally specific groups may feel more connected because of their shared roots, and it might be easier to identify with each other and find that group cohesion. It also allows survivors to see someone who is more like them in the different stages of the healing journey, and we saw that with Scott in his story earlier. On the other side of that, we have to remember that not everyone interacts with their culture the same. The survivor could have a very painful history with their culture and would rather be in the culturally inclusive group due to confidentiality concerns as well. There also might be shared feelings of shame amongst culturally specific groups about victimization that could be re-traumatizing for members of the group who went through something similar, so we need to be aware of this as well. Culturally specific has also become synonymous with racial groups, but really culturally specific / population specific groups include LGBTQ groups, so LGBTQ support groups, let's be clear, secondary survivor support groups, and adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse groups. And the more groups available, the greater our ability is to have our entire community heal and access services. Particularly when it comes to sexual violence services, unless the term male or men is specifically highlighted, the service is automatically assumed to be for women. We have to continue to do the work to break down these stereotypes, but we also need to provide space for other genders. To be clear, if you receive funding under VAWA, you are required to provide equal and equitable service options when it comes to sex-segregated services. Gender-specific groups, again, allow for that peer modeling that was discussed in the video and can also be a safe place for people to discuss how gender stereotypes and myths have impacted them. Facilitators need to be prepared to discuss those stereotypes and validate participant feelings. Facilitators also need to be aware of how society has taught different genders to socialize and communicate, and take this into consideration for the group as well. We know that many of our services still center women, so when we say things like gender-specific support groups, many folks' minds go straight to men, but that shouldn't be the case. We don't want to leave out gender nonconforming and non-binary participants, and they often feel excluded when there are only gender-specific options available. But that's why each group needs to be reflective of the needs of your community. Maybe your community would benefit from a group that screens participants, but has no end date. Maybe your support group could have a set curriculum, but it's open to teen survivors of sexual violence in your community. Whatever the needs of your community are, that is how your group should look and function. It's also about options. Having population-specific options could be healing for some survivors, but it might feel restricting for others. Having as many options as possible allows survivors to flex their own agency and make decisions that's best for them. In full disclosure, this training is jam-packed with lots of information, but I want to make sure that I leave you all with some guiding questions so you can fine-tune your own planning process. When forming a group, will this group have a firm start and end date? Are there any target populations for this group? And if yes, do we have the ability to offer a population-specific group? Remember, the goal of a support group is to create relationships, decrease stress, and strengthen coping skills. The type of group that will best serve the community does those things. There can and should be more than one type of support group, but narrowing down a type helps survivors know what to expect and depend on. So we're going to dive into facilitation briefly here, but really I would suggest that you join us for the third webinar because that's when we're really going to get into the ins and out of support group facilitation. A facilitator's main job is to guide the sexual violence support group. Keeping in mind the roles of a sexual violence advocate, sexual violence support group facilitators know how to provide education and resources, explain agency policies, active listen, and maintain confidentiality. Facilitators also know how to lead discussions, draw participants in when needed, and when to ask others to step back as well. Facilitators can also mediate conflict and know the difference between an argument and a discussion. So we're going to do another Mentimeter, and I promise this is the last one of the day, but please, again, go to www.menti.com and then retype in that code. So www.menti.com and then type in the code 513494. What skills are important for sexual violence support group facilitator to have? What skills are important for a sexual violence support group facilitator to have? Ooh, humility. I didn't even think about that one. Knowledge, self-awareness, they're trauma-informed, listening skills, compassion. A lot of people are saying empathy, compassion, humility, de-escalation, cultural humility, emotional intelligence, boundaries, absolutely. Sense of humor, yeah. Hearing about people's trauma can be very distressing, so we have to be able to diffuse it and help survivors get back to a sense of calm. Growth, knowledge, non-judgmental. What skills are important for a sexual violence support group facilitator to have? Resourceful, empathy, non-judgmental. Thank you. Okay, you all gave really great answers. I appreciate it. So there are important skills, but first we're going to go over the best practices. Having 2 or more facilitators, depending on the size of the group, is important for a couple of reasons. First, if an issue arises that needs to be addressed immediately, one can step away and the other can keep the group going. It also can help demonstrate a healthy relationship and communication for the group, and it also allows each facilitator to learn from each other. Another strength is that if you have facilitators from 2 different backgrounds, it can promote more group inclusivity. And I think someone said that earlier on one of the Mentimators. Co-facilitation models also allow for a combining of strengths, built-in accountability, and an opportunity to demonstrate role plays and activities with someone who's not a part of the group. If possible, it should also be the same facilitators for the duration of the group, and that consistency, again, helps strengthen relationships. And if it's possible, we might want to consider having a mixed gendered team of co-facilitators to, again, demonstrate a safe and effective communication relationship amongst those with different identities. Before facilitating a support group on your own or even with a partner, new facilitators should shadow experienced advocates doing groups and also receive training specifically on facilitating support groups. Beyond training and facilitation, facilitators who are not advocates should be trained in basic advocacy skills. Facilitators also know how to maintain clear boundaries with participants. So beyond our own personal and professional boundaries, our agencies should be providing us direction on things such as giving and receiving gifts, transporting participants, and giving out personal contact information. The group should also come up and set boundaries around these things as well. Especially when working with sexual violence survivors, facilitators look for ways to demonstrate healthy boundaries and asking for consent. So for example, an advocate might err on the side of caution when it comes to touching participants, but once they are given consent, they might know that it is okay to give a certain participant a light shoulder touch. When it comes to disclosing our own personal trauma histories as facilitators, best practice is to use discretion unless agency policy dictates otherwise. Disclosing our own personal history might allow for survivors to find that sameness and might make survivors feel more comfortable to share. It can also take away some of the shame and secrecy around being a survivor. This, however, comes with that caveat that facilitators need to be more aware of their own emotions and remain emotionally separate from the group. They have to remain professional and be there as a calm and regulated support person and not seek emotional support for their own trauma for the group. So I'm going to name some of these skills that they need to have. Facilitators are good communicators, right? They're able to make jokes. They have that emotional intelligence. They can easily demonstrate respectful and non-aggressive communication. They pick up on nonverbal cues and tones, and they know how to ask questions for understanding. They also know when and how to verbally de-escalate harmful situations, but they also know the differences between harmful situations and a difference of opinions. They also know how to intervene when these exchanges become harmful and boundaries are being crossed. Being a safe person and being a good facilitator is also about respecting the boundaries of others. Facilitators are also well-versed in their agency policies and procedures and can explain them well to survivors. This includes our grievance policies as well. So we briefly talked about how respecting other people's boundaries is a part of being a safe person, but I want to know more what you all think about this. So please put your answers in the chat box. How do you create a sense of safety in your work? How do you create a sense of safety in your work? Oh, you all are answering very quickly. I appreciate it. Okay. Resourceful, empathy, no judgment, knowing other resources for them, clear guidelines designed by the group at the beginning. Thank you all. Creating a mutual trust and confidentiality assurance. Thank you. Knowing resources for our clients. How do you create a space of trust and safety in our work? Confidentiality, providing resources. I let them know I don't know everything, but I will find someone that does. I really love that answer. Always being honest. Yes, thank you all so much. And so you all are saying trust, you're saying being open and honest, you're saying you're going back to your confidentiality and providing resources. And all these things are all a part of trauma-informed care. So thank you for highlighting them. So facilitators also look inward and see how they can improve. And I think that really encompasses someone who said they're honest, right? And that takes introspection. Facilitators should be continuously reflecting on how their own actions, beliefs, and experiences color their biases and how it affects the services that they provide. On that same note, facilitators are conscious of how their identities affect the group dynamics. If they are a well-known person in their community outside of the role that they hold in their agency that holds some power, they may not be the best person to facilitate the group. Or if a survivor knows them, the survivor should be offered a chance to join another group. If they're related or know one of the participants' family members very well, that also may not be the best group for that facilitator or for that survivor. Advocates should explain and let the survivor know about their confidentiality obligations, but it is ultimately the survivor's choice whether they stay in that particular group. And if there's a discussion to be had about that, that should be done by the other co-facilitator. Group facilitators should initiate and guide the group, but they shouldn't dominate the groups, and whether that's intentionally or unintentionally with our own identities. It may be harder in rural communities, but facilitators need to be able to establish relationships so that they are trusted, but not hold so much sway and power that they are feared or rejected because of their influence. Well-balanced and emotionally healthy facilitators also know when to ask for help, whether that be taking some time away from the group, coming up with new ideas, or getting some perspective through an evaluation. But most importantly, they also practice self-care. And this also goes back to having clear boundaries, but especially after the support group, when you might have listened to multiple people recount different parts of their trauma, facilitators know how to decompress and disconnect from the group. Self-care is critical in sustaining ourselves in this work. But what do those skills actually look like? What are some prompts? It might look like summarizing. What I heard you say was you felt uncomfortable when that person brushed against you on the bus. What I'm gathering from the group is this sense of shame, and I want us to explore that a little bit more. We want to practice that empathizing and validating. Several people have described feeling angry when they were being dismissed after the assault. I heard you all, and I really want to validate those feelings. We also want to reflect. So what I heard everyone say is they didn't like that last activity because it felt incomplete. Did anyone else come to that conclusion? Clarifying. I heard you say this sucks. Can you tell me more about that? It also might be questioning, and good facilitators know how to ask questions. What's coming up for everyone right now in this moment? And it also includes cutting folks off sometimes. Thank you for sharing. I want to remind everyone of the shared agreements of the group, and we said that we wouldn't interrupt each other. I don't think we finished hearing what Victoria was saying. I would love to hear what you have to say, but I don't think Chris was done speaking. If the interrupting or cutting off continues to happen, facilitators should address it directly, but most times people don't know they're doing it. And here are some basic questions for finding a facilitator. If we have multiple facilitators, are there two people who might work well together in this topic or in this setting? How could the facilitators' identities affect the dynamics of the group? What ties do the facilitators have to the community? We already talked about that self-reflection that facilitators need to do, but co-facilitators also need to have honest conversations about their different communication styles, ideas, and visions for the group to ensure that they meld well together before the group starts. So this is also about the midway point, so I want to stop and check the chat box for questions. All right, I'm not seeing any, so again, feel free to go ahead and ask questions. So here are some more general best practices. Before we get into those nitty-gritty logistics, we need to talk about some of these general things. And some of them are multiple groups are best, so survivors can choose which one is the best fit for them. Groups should also make sure that they come up with a list of shared agreements together, and that way everyone is involved and equally invested in them and also invested in maintaining them. If you want to look up some examples, you can find them in the Circle of Hope guide. Agencies also need to develop and spend some time outreaching when adding any new service, but specifically for your support group. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about outreach in part 2, but a variety of outreach approaches, including in rural communities such as word of mouth, need to be utilized in order to promote your services. Outreach can also be critical to the attendance and success of your group. We also need to make sure that we're checking for survivors' basic needs at the beginning of the group. And this will probably need to be done as one-on-one conversations at first, because we know there might be shame around that. But as the group progresses, you might be able to attack this more openly. We're also going to be talking about evaluation and screening in parts 3 and 2, respectively, but I want to be sure and it's clear that they are both necessary and highly valuable pieces of running a support group. Okay, how might an open support group be different from an AA meetings, besides the obvious differences related to substance abuse, domestic violence? So thanks for asking that question. So domestic violence support groups are really designed to provide support, and there isn't specifically with AA groups this emphasis on having like one-on-one connections. It's more of a group connection, and also sexual and domestic violence groups, they are very conscious of how people's traumas might come up in the group, and they are especially trained in handling some of those skills. No problem. Okay, going right back into it. 6 to 8 people is also the golden number that was given for support groups. Groups can still function with less participants, and they may be able to, and this might be a reality in real settings, until a repertoire or a reputation for the group can be determined. Any more people, however, so if you want to go to 9, 10, 20, it can be difficult for the members to form deeper connections, and it can also be difficult for the facilitators to listen and try to form relationships with that many people. Also, before we go any further, remember that each of these best practices can be shifted for the needs of your community. So when we're talking about the duration and frequency of groups, it's been found that 2 hours a week is the best duration for support groups, and that varies from 90 minutes to 2 hours. If we're talking about team support groups, the time limit is around 50 minutes. Any less, and it becomes hard for everyone to be able to participate, and any more, people start to get distracted and have other obligations to attend to. Having the same group time and date is also a part of being predictable and safe. So we also have to talk about location. And we already touched on this, but especially in rural communities, the location of a support group is key. Best practice is actually to hold support groups both in person and virtual to give survivors as many options to attend as possible. But if you can only do an in-person group, try to have a group in a central location where people in the community frequent. We need to be conscious of the distance participants would have to travel to get to the group, how survivors' confidentiality needs might change on the time of the day when picking a location as well. So for example, a group between 11 and 2 p.m. might be okay for participants who have school-age children, but it might not be good for people who work 9 to 5 jobs. 5 to 7 might be better for people who work earlier shifts. This might be the prime time for people who have to take care of homework, cook dinner, and have other responsibilities. Applicants should also be skilled in safety planning and should be making time during the group to safety plan leaving and coming to the location. If a survivor can be seen walking in and out of the location from the street or from just a layperson walking by, we might want to be considering a different location. And here's a sample list. Now, again, this needs to be reflective of the needs of your communities. I don't know what all of your communities are like, but you do, so just think about some general areas. You might want to consider a place that gets moderate traffic, but is also non-specific, can be used for multiple reasons, but also has a layer of anonymity around it. So for example, if I wanted to use a faith center for my support group, this might work because a lot of different people come to faith centers. They're used for multiple things, right? They can be used for choir practice, they can be used for food banks, they can be used for unsheltered services, right? A lot of people utilize these centers. And then in the picture that's used, this might be a good location because we can see there's this wall here in the background, so people can't see it, they were just walking by, but it's also outside and people have room to spread out. So this also might be a good location, but we don't know what the entrance looks like, right? So people might be able to see them walking in from the street, so it's not that confidential. And I want to acknowledge that in rural areas, there might be less of these places, but that is where it's the co-facilitator's roles to be creative and ask for support in finding the right location for a support group. And here are some questions for consideration. And I'll have these after every part in this section. So by the end of the training, you'll have a long list of questions for each aspect of your planning process that you can answer individually. How visible are the entrances of the place where the group is being held? Is this location accessible to those with disabilities? And what changes need to be made to secure the group location? What plausible reason could people have to be at that location during that time? Again, we need to make sure that we're trying to maintain people's confidentiality, so we should consider locations that people might frequent for other reasons. Also, when we're thinking about changes that need to be made, this could be smaller things like closing up blinds, changing the setup of the room so that no participants are in the room of the door, or making sure the front desk knows who you are and what participants might say they're looking for. It's all going to depend on the individual space. Transportation and childcare can also be barriers for those who would otherwise attend, and you all named those right away. We know that participants are very resilient and can find ways to meet their needs, but facilitators have to be conscious of those needs and should be asking if they need support from time to time. This could be things like making a relationship with the local transportation company in your town to provide rides for participants coming and going to the support group, or investing in a number of bus passes at your agency. It could also be engaging with your volunteer base and seeing if anyone is able to provide childcare for the group. And these are some childcare and transportation considerations. If our ability to provide childcare changes, how will we let survivors know? We need to let survivors know as soon as possible so they can adjust their plans and also strategize about how they can still participate in the support group. Also, if we're going to be able to offer childcare, we need to consider that when selecting a location for the group as well. If possible, we should try to select a place where the children are close by, if not within eyesight. So we already kind of talked about how a mixture of both virtual and in-person support groups are best practice, but considering the pandemic and the distance that many in rural communities have to travel, virtual support groups might be an option worth investing your time and energy in. There are a lot of free options for virtual platforms out there, so I suggest you do your research before committing to one. Before you do, we need to make sure that that platform is accessible. Are there directions written in multiple languages? Is there live transcription available? Is the content of the screen large enough to read? Can you send documents on the platform? Are there dial-in options? We also want to acknowledge that shifting to virtual platforms can be very, very difficult and frustrating for participants, especially older survivors who are already left out of a lot of our services. So before switching or starting a virtual group, facilitators need to provide adequate notice of the change, directions on how to access and navigate the platform, and it also might be helpful to do live tutorials at the beginning of the group. When it comes to securing the platform, many services have different privacy settings to tap into as well. And at the beginning of the pandemic especially, we were seeing how a lot of those bugs weren't really worked out, and we saw this with Zoom bombing and people harassing different groups virtually. We have to be aware of the different privacy functions of our platforms that we're using and also the concerns of just having virtual meetings. Even if the facilitator is not intentionally recording the meetings, that meeting is being recorded somewhere, so we need to do our own due diligence when it comes to those privacy concerns. And so Victoria has already put in some of those resources in the chat, but the NNABB has done a Zoom review. They've reviewed some video conferencing and digital communication platforms, and they also have a whole digital service toolkit for advocates. So please check those resources out. And Victoria has put them in the chat again, just for your reference. What steps need to be taken to secure the virtual platform? How well does this platform accommodate the accessibility needs of this group? How are technology/connection issues for the group going to be addressed? We have to talk about those technology issues. And we know that oftentimes people outside of city limits, even in city limits, have more problems with internet connections. With virtual services, we need to be aware of this and strategize with survivors about how they can still virtually attend the group. Can they appear by phone only as an option? Can we get our agencies to provide a hotspot or a laptop or a tablet for the duration of the group and maybe even beyond? Is there somewhere near their house that offers free Wi-Fi? Can our agency get them a small stipend for the duration of the group to upgrade their internet packages? These are just some general options to consider when addressing not only technology issues, but the technology gap many face now that services have gone virtual. Confidentiality can be an integral part of maintaining a survivor's safety and well-being, And we have to all, including facilitators and participants, understand this. Every time the group meets, facilitators should be reviewing and renewing these commitments about confidentiality that the group has established and discuss why they are so important. We should also be emphasizing that not only can it put others in danger if someone's confidentiality is violated, but sharing anything outside of what the survivor personally learned in a group can break the trust amongst participants and everyone's right to privacy. This also means that facilitators should set clear and model clear boundaries for the group, not only about what behaviors and actions are appropriate, but also reaffirming boundaries set by others in the group and having discussions about what everyone feels comfortable sharing and not sharing, and how to approach these things when they come up. We should also be taking the bare minimum documentation that's required of us to also better maintain participants' confidentiality. Your agency should be providing some guidance on this, but you should not be recording information that could potentially hurt a survivor if it was obtained by someone else. 2 slides about confidentiality because it's extremely important. Especially in rural areas, facilitators should expect participants may know each other in some way or another. One participant's sibling could be the person who caused another participant harm, or participants might even discover that they've been harmed by the same person. And this can be challenging in many different ways for participants. Facilitators need to encourage discussions about confidentiality, privacy, and trust, and encourage these ideas to come from the group itself. There more than likely will not be a one-size-fits-all for every situation, but the facilitators need to reemphasize how important these conversations are when they impact personal safety and also the group safety as a whole. But these conversations, again, can't happen without trust. As you all identified earlier, you build trust by listening, by sharing, by having groups share with each other, and offering support and communicating. This may take time to do, and facilitators have to see the value in this. We also have to take time to discuss with participants how they will interact with each other outside of the space. How will the participants like the facilitator to communicate important changes within the group? In smaller communities, what should be the approach if a group member sees each other in public, if they see the facilitator in public? These are some things that have to be discussed so there aren't assumptions made and that they can end because they impact everyone's safety. The group also has to set parameters around what happens if confidentiality is violated within the group. What if one participant unintentionally violates everyone's confidentiality because they were followed or they forgot that their location services were on? What if they told someone else about another participant attending the group? Your agency may already provide guidance on this, but it should also be discussed amongst the group as well. There needs to be a set plan of action when instances occur, and facilitators need to be able to communicate about confidentiality violations effectively when they happen. How are facilitators going to communicate changes in the group between sessions? Are they going to send encrypted messages on a specific platform? Are survivors going to create a new email for the group and that's how they're going to communicate? Are they not going to communicate outside of the group at all? These things have to be communicated. How are facilitators going to set up the foundations of safety within and outside of the group for participants? What is the process when confidentiality or safety is violated in the group? How are participants going to be notified? Is the group going to stop? Will the location need to change? Will that person no longer be in the group? These are some of the things that needs to be discussed and agreed upon within the group. And some of you name this perfectly. We're asking those questions on Mentimeter. The perceptions and social factors might not be supportive for survivors. The agency, but specifically co-facilitators, will need to focus on building community rapport before groups begin. This could be things like going to community events, setting up an open house for folks to come and ask questions about the group, offering to co-train about your services, and intentionally engaging with community members and community leaders. Agencies should be developing those relationships consistently regardless, but especially when you're promoting a new service in your service area that folks might not be so sure of. And I will also say this again in the outreach training, and I'm sure Doreen will reference it in the facilitation training too, but because of the perception of sexual violence in the community, and especially in more conservative communities, we might have to do outreach for a long time before someone actually shows up to the support group. The important thing is that we have to continue to show up for survivors and potential participants so that they can eventually reach us and start to build those relationships. But because we also don't want to make assumptions about what our community thinks, it might be helpful to conduct a community assessment. If you need help with conducting a community assessment, you can contact me or Victoria or Marley, and we can guide you in the right direction. And if you want to go ahead and get started, Victoria is going to drop a resource for the Research Sharing Project Rural Project that has some resources for conducting community assessments. Oh, and there she did it. So there's that resource. In more insular communities, we know that sexual violence can be difficult to discuss and that there might even be more support for the person that harmed the survivor participant than for the participant themselves. By attending the support group, the participant could be further accused of spilling secrets, accused of dwelling on the past, or outright lying, and be further ostracized for telling their story. Survivors might have even internalized some of these harmful messages themselves, so we need to value survivors' participation, their willingness to share, and their willingness to seek out support. We also need to make sure that we're providing that emotional validation and highlighting their strengths. We also, as our agencies, as facilitators, need to be examples in our community of people who offer constant education and support to survivors while building relationships. This is how we take a part in shifting the culture. We should be considering how sexual violence is viewed in the community, but just because the whole community isn't supportive of survivors doesn't mean that we don't move forward in providing services, including a support group. There should be an effort to increase community buy-in, but we can't let that stop us from building those services. It does mean, however, that we need to be conscious of how the group is promoted and discussed with major stakeholders and make sure that we're doing our due diligence to increase community engagement. So some of these questions were directly inspired and taken from the RSP resource that Victoria shared in the chat. How is sexual violence being discussed in your community? How are sexual violence survivors viewed in the community? What is the community's relationship to your agency service? What work has your agency done to promote your sexual violence services in the community? How can you incorporate community feedback and input into forming a support group? If you're at an open house and people express their concerns about the topics that will be covered, consider making a brief list of topics, but also asking for community input as well. How can you increase community buy-in for your support group? And these questions will specifically require some self-reflection on behalf of your agency, and to implement some of these things, there has to be a willingness to try something new. Then lastly, we have funding. So funding, as we all know, is important. Again, support groups did start organically with survivors supporting each other and being dedicated to meet. But our reality is that within programs, services become more sustainable when funded. Your support group should be a part of your agency's budget, and you should consider how much things like outreach or activities and other things you may need for your support group will cost, and factor those things in. We also know that a lot of support groups rely on group funding. There are funding sources that have been used to fund sexual violence direct services in the past, and sexual violence groups are a part of those core services. So some funding sources that might be under VAWA might be SAS, which is the Sexual Assault Services Funding Program, and STOP, which is Services Training Officers and Prosecutors Grant. And then there are also some different discretionary grants like the Culturally Specific Assault Services Grant, the Rural Grant, the Disabilities Grant, and the Outreach and Services to Underserved Populations Grant that can be used to provide sexual assault support group funds for those specific populations. Then there's also the Victims of Crime Assistance. Oops. Oh, sorry. The Arizona Crime Justice Commission also has a Victims Assistance Grant as well. Just trying to make sure I got all those acronyms right. But still, check your specific grant objectives and requirements, though, to make sure that you still qualify and sexual violence support group services qualify under those grants. We can also try to get private foundation grants, and also make sure that we can engage the community and get community support to not only promote the support group, but also fund different parts of it. And this is where we really get creative about those community asks. What are some tangible items that can be donated? Maybe that's movies, maybe that's games. How can survivors or community members donate their time, right? Maybe they can create some of the materials, maybe they can do the childcare. How is this support group engaging the community? How can we combine the funding opportunity with outreach, right? So maybe someone offers to donate t-shirts to us and we put their logo on the back of it, right? So we got the t-shirts that we needed and they got the free advertising opportunity. The community may not be able to fulfill tens of thousands of dollars, but when that combined support is available, it might be able to help the community feel more connected to the group. When the community feels like they help contribute to the group or build it in some way, it also might make them feel more invested in its success and its outcomes. And so I didn't want to leave you all without talking about a sample group outline either. So when you're running a group from start to finish, what's something that we can do and what activities should we include? I should probably get a shirt that says this by now, but the group structure should be reflective of the needs of the participants and the community. This outline specifically comes straight from Circle of Hope, and I even put the page number so you can go directly to it. So we have the goal of the session, check-in, handouts, learning and discussion, activity, self-care, the checkout, and then that's followed by resources. And Victoria put it again in the chat for your reference. So I wanted to make sure we also got some examples of some of these things. The goal of the session is the objective of the group and what participants are supposed to gain from attending. So in our sample goal of the session, participants will learn how to establish verbal boundaries. The learning and discussion is the content and education of the group. By encouraging discussion, the facilitators can help participants connect to information to their own lives and their own situations. Learning and discussion provides the opportunity for survivors to integrate their experiences with a wider range of knowledge and consider other people's thinking who might have experienced something similar. And this can also be combined with step 3 of the handout, but the handout isn't always necessary either. So for example, if your activity is going to be you're making a vision board, a handout might not always be necessary. So in our sample learning and discussion point, participants might receive a handout about boundaries, talk about some of the boundaries they have and what they did when their boundaries crossed. And then lastly, we have the activity. An activity is when the group can participate and practice the skills that they learn in the discussion. And it sometimes also makes sense to do them before the learning and discussion and use that time to reflect as a group. Activities serve to build group cohesion, encourage members in active listening, and to make the sessions more interesting and enjoyable. And this is the same reason that we spend time doing icebreakers, right? We want people to be invested and have time to build those relationships. It's also important to get participant group feedback about the structure and agenda, about the content and discussions, and about the activities of the group. So if something is not working for the group, don't be afraid to switch it up. And here's a sample list of group topics. Again, this should be reflective of the needs of your communities. Even if you're using a curriculum or workbook that has predetermined topics, you still need to vet them and make sure that they're culturally relevant to your community and also the population of the group. So for example, if we use this list that's on this slide, it might not be appropriate to talk to teens about the impact of abuse on children or talking with children about abuse. But we might want to spend more time talking about sexual health with them. So again, adjust it as needed. All content activities need to be inclusive of different cultures and healing journeys. And this can be a combination of games, role play, or other activities. Whatever helps survivors cope and gives them an opportunity for them to build relationships should be explored. We should also be soliciting ideas from the group and utilizing their talents. So one example I have is of a group, and one of the survivors was used to be a classical pianist. They were an older survivor. And so they sometimes played the piano for the group, and they sung and did songs. And that was a way to build those relationships. And there's some examples of group activities. Victoria, if you can also drop the grounding toolkit in the chat. And that can be a tool that you all use. You go through the toolkit as a group and you practice doing some of those grounding exercises. You might also want to do the clothesline project, right? So combining support with art, asking for consent, right? Demonstrating those boundaries. These are just some activities that might be helpful, particularly for sexual violence survivors. And here are some materials. Again, those materials are going to change with the needs of your group and the topic of the group, but we need to be creative about what materials we're asking for and how we meet those needs. So these are a list of all the resources that I talked about during the presentation today. I wanted to make sure you have them, and don't worry about taking a picture of it now. You all will get a copy of the slides. Are there any questions? So thank you everybody for attending. That is the end of the group today. My email and my contact information are on the slides, and I greatly appreciate it. So if you want to stick around, I will be explaining how to get a certificate for the presentation, but that is the end for today. And thank you all so much for coming.